When one talks about intoxicants in general, the difficult thing to convey to people, because of the way the culture works, is how important what we take in really is. And people tend to minimize that. They tend to not think about it. They tend to put it in a special category as if it were really remarkable that once in a while somebody uses an intoxicant or what have you. But in fact, if you talk to people, it's astonishing what percentage of our emotional life really is caught up in what we ingest. I'm including food here as well as intoxicants, but it has a certain similarity with each other. You know, I think Freud was right. To work and to love are really where the two most important aspects of our emotional life. Of what we do with ourselves, how we function, where we get our self-esteem, all that, and our relationships, whether we're close to people, whether we're not close, and so on. There's no question that those are the two most significant factors. But if you really want the next factor with the decline of religion, I really do think it's what we ingest. And whether we've taken in too much or too little, when we're going to take it in, when we're not going to take it in, what we really like, what we don't like, with whom, under what circumstances, really is astonishingly a busy notion. And intoxicants remain part of it, of whether we're going to do anything or not do it. And it really starts in early adolescence, and it continues through much of your life in one form or another. And it's sort of like a hidden secret that that this goes on and that people care about and are interested. It's astonishing, again, how little people really pay attention. Now, if that's true, that this is a really very important factor, and it's an important factor in virtually everyone's life, and I would include people who are abstinent, incidentally, retaining yourself as abstinent is just as much what you do and what you don't do as if you're doing something. So it isn't as if you can deal with it once and for all by not ever doing anything. That requires reaffirmation throughout much of your life. So that if you accept that, and if you accept what the anthropologists tell us, that there are no known cultures except the far north Eskimos that have not used an intoxicant on some regular basis. Every culture ever studied, and as I like to say, the far north Eskimos breathe deeply a lot. That they had these rituals where they did a lot of deep breathing and so on, threw themselves on the ground and so on, which also is a form of intoxication, but they never were able to make anything out of blubber that I know of that worked. But their diets were very restricted, and it's astonishing that they managed to work out the rituals they did. But if that's true too, that everybody does it, which again you wouldn't think was so in this sort of puritanical culture, then the important thing is not whether one uses an intoxicant so much, is how one uses it, of how we differentiate between use and misuse, of how we think about how it works for a particular person in a particular cultural setting. And that really changes the discussion a great deal. And you would hardly know it in this culture where there really is sort of an implication of why do you have to do this anyway? You know, like maybe everybody would be better off if there were no such substances and if nobody had to bother with it. Again, it makes it seem like an artifact and to a certain extent a moral issue. Now, my thing that I've been working on for all too many years is that if you are going to understand anything about intoxicant use, what causes a person to do it, how they do it, and how it's going to work in their lives, you have to understand three variables, and you have to know all three of them. You have to know about the drug itself, or the substance itself, the set, that is how people think and feel about doing it, and in my definition that includes their personality structure, and then the physical and social setting in which the use takes place. And that all three have to be understood and worked with if we're going to make any sense at all of how these things work. Now, in recent years we've begun, I think, to really recognize all three, and it's only been recently that the notion that the social setting is a crucial aspect of this has really been recognized at all. Before, I would say, the last 15 years, one really did not think in terms of the physical and social setting. They thought in terms of the drug, and drugs are different. They have different pharmacological properties, and the work that's been done on drugs in the last 25 years since the so-called drug revolution, which most people put at 1962, that since then there's been a tremendous amount of work done, research work, and we do know a lot about the pharmacological properties of these drugs. It's astonishing how little we knew up till 25 years ago when you consider the long history of use of every one of the substances that's in general use today. But we've learned a lot, and you know, we can tell you almost anything about what marijuana or cocaine or anything else does to white mice. I mean, we really know that backwards and forwards now, and that's very important data, and we have dose response curves. We really have a lot of things that we didn't have. The research on the set variable is still much less good. It's a very tricky variable, really, to think in terms of what is the influence of personality. And again, before the last 25 years, in many respects, people saw the set variable as the predominant variable. The notion of an addictive personality structure was really very generally accepted, that some people simply were bad. And it wasn't so much considered genetically bad, that's more recent work, but it was bad because of what they were like, that they just were oral dependent, they were schizzy, they were in one form or another ready to use anything. And if you look at this material, it was hard to differentiate whether these personality characteristics were determinants in anybody who used it all, or whether they were only determinants in people who really became addicted and got into serious trouble. Although the discussion was about addiction, there's a lot of allusions in the early literature that leads one to suspect that anybody who used it all were sort of oral dependent and what have you. And much of the material, I like to quote Robert Knight, who was one of the at his time was the most, one of the most important psychiatrists in the country. He had been clinical director at Menninger's, and then he came to Stockbridge, Mass, and really turned Austin Riggs from a small detox center, essentially, for rich people, into a very important place where people could get treated and where the studies of therapy would go on. But for some reason, late in his life, he decided he was going to take the boards of psychiatry and neurology. Knight was a big man, very much an analyst, very involved in all those things. And so somebody asked him a question about the influence of the mammary bodies on alcoholism. Mammary bodies are small centers in the hypothalamus. And Knight responded that he didn't know anything about the influence of the mammary bodies, but he knew a lot about the influence of the mammary glands. And that was sort of the implication, that if you sucked at the bottle, you were sucking at the tit. That it was really considered close to some sort of relationship with very primitive, early notions of growing up and what it meant to be a human being and so on. And intoxicants, this was clearly more alcohol, but which has been the predominant intoxicant used in this country, was the one, but still it applied equally to other things. People tried it with any kind of addiction. So the set variable didn't turn out really to be very interesting, because as we began to do more comprehensive studies, particularly more longitudinal studies, the set variable didn't hold up very well. The set variable got its prominence from retrospective studies. In other words, you saw somebody who had become addicted, and when you spent time with him and looked at him, he looked a certain way. And many people who are addicted look a lot the same. They really are people who are both very needy on the one hand, antisocial on another, antagonistic, depressed. All those characteristics you can find in almost anyone who's been an addict for any period of time, and particularly if they've come into a treatment center. So they would say, well, they must have been like this before. What we're seeing now is not the result of the addiction, but the cause of the addiction. And that was how most of these studies came about. And particularly if they got into trouble as a result of their antisocial feelings. If they had criminal behavior, if they were this and that, then it was very easy to say that they had always been bad antisocial people. Now, in fact, if you really look closely in longitudinal studies and whatever work you can get where people have been interviewed before they got into trouble, then you began to see that they weren't so different from anybody else.